Hi, we're going to be reading The Pie. And as we're reading, I want you to highlight in blue at least two descriptive phrases that help you understand the story better, sensory details, or things that you think, wow, that was really descriptive. Highlight in green at least one simile, and write down in the margin how you think Soto was trying to have an effect there and what he was trying to say. And then any moments in yellow, I want you to highlight when he feels like doubt or guilt or change or growth, because the character is going through a lot of this. He's trying to decide if he should steal this pie and then how he feels about it in the end. So, the pie. I knew enough about hell to stop me from stealing. I was holy in almost every bone. And some days I recognized the shadow of angels flopping on the backyard grass. And other days I heard faraway messages in the plumbing that howled beneath the house when I crawled there looking for something to do. And I highlighted this blue part because I thought that was a really descriptive way of describing how he felt connected to his religion and God almost. He believes that God's in the house, that angels are there and aware, and he was afraid of hell, so he didn't want to steal. But boredom made me sin. Once at the German market, I stood before a rack of pies, my sweet tooth gleaming and the juice of guilt wetting my armpits. I gazed at the 9 kinds of pie, pecan and apple being my favorites, although cherry looked good, and my dear fat-faced chocolate was always a good bet. I nearly wept trying to decide which to steal and forgetting the flowery dust priests give off. This would be part of what he could feel guilty about. You could highlight that. Or the shadow of angels and the proximity of God howling in the plumbing underneath the house. All of that is aspects of that he could feel guilty because remember, he thinks that God is present and that he could go to hell. Sneaked a pie behind my coffee lid frisbee and walked to the door, grinning to the bald grocer whose forehead shone with the window of light. No one saw, I muttered to myself, the pie like a discus in my hand. And there is a simile, so you could highlight that and write what you think he's meaning there. And I hurried across the street where I sat on someone's lawn. So he successfully hid the pie underneath his hand, and he ran across the street. The sun wavered between the branches of a yellowish sycamore. A squirrel nailed itself high on the trunk where it forked into 2 large barked scab limbs. Just as I was going to work my cleanest finger into the pie, a neighbor came out to the porch for his mail, and he looked at me, and I got up and headed for home. I was feeling a little guilty there. I raced on skinny legs to my block, but slowed to a quick walk when I couldn't wait any longer. I held the pie to my nose and breathed in its sweetness. I licked some of the crust and closed my eyes as I took a small bite. In my front yard, I leaned against a car fender and panicked about stealing the apple pie. Guilt's kind of growing here. I knew a pie got Eve in deep trouble with snakes because Sister Mary had shown us a film about Adam and Eve being cast into the desert. And what scared me more than falling from grace was being thirsty for the rest of my life. So he didn't want to be cast into the desert for stealing, right? But even that didn't stop me from clawing a chunk from the pie tin and pushing it into the cavern of my mouth. The slop was sweet and gold-colored in the afternoon sun. What great description! I love his description. I laid more pieces on my tongue, wet finger dripping pieces until I was finished and felt like crying because it was the best thing I had ever tasted. I realized right there and then, in my 6th year, he's only 6 years old, in my tiny body of 200 bones and 3 or 4 sins, that the best things in life came stolen. I wiped my sticky fingers on the grass and rolled my tongue over the corners of my mouth, and a burp perfumed the air. I felt bad not sharing with cross-eyed Jimmy, a neighbor kid. He stood over my shoulder and asked, "Can I have some?" Crust fell from my mouth and my teeth were bathed with a jam-like filling. Tears blurred my eyes as I remembered the grocer's forehead. I remembered the other pies on the rack, the warm air of the fan above the door, and the car that honked as I crossed the street without looking. "Get away," I had answered cross-eyed Johnny. He watched my fingers greedily push big chunks of pie down my throat. He swallowed and said in a whisper, "Your hands are dirty," then returned home to climb his roof and sit watching me eat the pie by myself. After a while, he jumped off and hobbled away because the fall had hurt him. I sat on the curb. The pine tin glared at me and rolled away when the wind picked up. My face was sticky with guilt. So now it's hit him. Before he was like, "Oh, stealing is the most wonderful thing." And now he's like, "Oh, I'm guilty." A car honked, and the driver knew. Mrs. Hancock stood on her lawn, hands on hip, and she knew. My mom, peeling a mountain of potatoes at the Ready Spud factory, knew. All this guilt is building in him. I got to my feet, stomach taut, mouth tired of chewing, and flung my frisbee across the street. Its shadow like the shadow of an angel fleeing bad deeds. I retrieved it, jogging slowly. I flung it again until I was bored and thirsty. I returned home to drink water and help my sister glue bottle caps onto cardboard, a project for summer school. But the bottle caps bored me, and the water soon filled me up more than the pie. With the kitchen stifling with heat and lunatic flies, I decided to crawl underneath our house and lie in the cool shadows listening to the hollowing sound of plumbing. Was it God? Was it Father speaking from the dead? Or Uncle with his last shiny dime? I listened, ears pressed to a cold pipe, and heard a howl like the sea. I lay until I was cold, and then crawled back to the light, rising from one knee and then another, to dust off my pants and squint in the harsh light. I looked and saw the glare of a pie tin on a hot day. And then I knew sin was what you took and didn't give back. So he's kind of come full circle. I underlined and asked you to underline the last line. I knew sin was what you took and didn't give back. And also the first line, which was, I knew enough about hell to keep me from stealing. So he starts off about knowing enough about hell, and that's what's going to keep him from stealing, but he does it anyway, because hell is just this kind of abstract thing. But then it really sinks into him, and he realizes, you know what? Actually, hell or sin is how you feel when you take something and you can't give it back because of the guilt you feel and how you feel like you've done a bad thing to the poor grocer. So that's our story. Very descriptive. Please make sure you highlight everything and Dropbox it, and I will talk to you later. Thanks.